The family believed she was a mistake. The ugly daughter, the burden, the difficult one. When they found out a wealthy man had asked for her hand in marriage, they did the unthinkable. They sent Maria Clara away like trash, discarded in the cruelest way possible. But what they didn't know was that they were handing over the rarest treasure the farmer had been searching for his entire life.
When the family found out that someone had asked for their ugly, troublemaking daughter's hand in marriage, they sent her off as if she were garbage, dumped in the cruelest way they could imagine, not knowing they were handing over exactly the rarest treasure the farmer had dreamed of finding. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, carried by the postman who could barely hide the malicious smile on his face. He knew exactly what that envelope meant to the Montero family. Everyone in town knew. When he placed the paper in the hands of Carlos Montero, the patriarch of the family, the man broke the seal with the curiosity of someone expecting more news, but instead he found something much better, a golden opportunity. João Pedro Silveira, the most prosperous farmer in the neighboring region, was asking for the hand of one of the Montero daughters in marriage. He had built a rural empire from nothing. He owned more land than any other landowner within a 100-kilometer radius, and his reputation as an honest worker echoed through all the towns in the countryside. He was exactly the kind of son-in-law any family would want. The problem was that João Pedro had asked specifically for Maria Clara. Carlos called his wife Helena and the two eldest daughters into the sitting room. Ana Beatriz, the 26-year-old eldest, sat with the perfect posture she had been taught since childhood. Isabella, 24, adjusted her dress with the natural elegance that always followed her. The two were the pride of the family, beautiful, educated, obedient, and marriageable. Any sensible man would choose one of them. "Read this," said Carlos, extending the letter with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Helena took the paper and began to read aloud. As the words left her mouth, the smile on her face grew in a way that was almost disturbing. The daughters exchanged confused looks until the mother reached the part where João Pedro specifically mentioned the name of Maria Clara as the desired bride. The silence that followed was broken by a burst of laughter from Ana Beatriz. Isabella soon joined in, and within seconds, the entire room echoed with laughter that had nothing joyful about it. They were cruel laughs, loaded with the morbid satisfaction that only truly wicked people can feel. "He asked for Maria Clara," Helena repeated, as if she needed to confirm what she had just read. "The richest and most respected man in the region asked for our Maria Clara in marriage." "This is perfect," said Carlos, clapping his hands together once. "Simply perfect." If you've just arrived here and you're not part of our family yet, subscribe to the channel. That's how we keep bringing stories that stir the heart and make you reflect about life. Write in the comments where you're listening from. We love to know how far our stories go. Maria Clara was not in the room during that conversation. She was in the back of the house looking after her sick grandmother, as she did every day since the old lady had fallen ill. It was always she who took on the hardest responsibilities, the care no one else wanted, the chores that dirtied your hands or demanded patience. While she applied cold compresses to her grandmother's forehead, she could hear the laughter coming from the sitting room. It wasn't unusual for her family to laugh at her expense, but there was something different about that laughter, something more cruel, more calculated. She knew that tone well. It was the same one they used when they were plotting some wickedness. The truth about Maria Clara Montero was far too complex to fit inside her family's limited perceptions. At 23, she had become a problem that grew bigger every day. Not because she was disobedient or rebellious in the traditional sense, but because she possessed something much more dangerous, an unshakable sense of justice, and the courage to act accordingly. 3 years earlier, when she discovered that the local judge was taking bribes to favor land grabbers, it was Maria Clara who gathered the evidence and handed it to the proper authorities. The resulting scandal cost the Montero family a series of lucrative deals that depended on judicial corruption. Carlos never forgave her for that. The following year, she exposed a scheme in which local merchants artificially raised the prices of basic food items during the dry season, taking advantage of the desperation of poorer families. Again, her intervention cost the family money, as they quietly shared in the inflated profits. The pattern repeated itself constantly. Maria Clara saw an injustice, investigated it on her own, and took steps to correct it, without caring about the financial consequences for her family. For the Monteros, who had built their fortunes sailing in murky waters between legality and convenience, having a daughter with a moral conscience was a constant nightmare. But there was another reason why they laughed with such satisfaction when they read João Pedro's letter. To her family's eyes, Maria Clara was physically unsuitable for a prestigious marriage. While her sisters had the delicate, refined beauty that society expected of respectable ladies, Maria Clara had a sturdier build, calloused hands from hard work, and a face marked by expressions of determination that her mother considered far too masculine. What they couldn't see, or refused to see, was that Maria Clara's physical strength reflected her strength of character, that her calloused hands told the story of someone who had never backed away from honest work, that her determined expressions revealed a soul incapable of passively accepting injustice. And it was exactly that strength of character that had caught the attention of João Pedro Silveira 5 years earlier, during an encounter that would change both their destinies forever. But the Montero family was about to discover that underestimating Maria Clara would be the greatest mistake of their lives. However, the story had a side that few knew about, one that would turn that supposed cruel joke into the greatest blessing Maria Clara had ever received. 5 years earlier, the weekly market in the town of São João do Vale was buzzing with the usual Saturday morning hustle. Vendors shouted prices, children ran between stalls, and the smell of sugarcane candy mixed with the aroma of fresh coffee coming from iron pots. João Pedro had arrived early to buy supplies for the farm, but stayed longer than he'd planned because of a scene that caught his eye. Near the fabric stall, 3 young women were talking to a lace merchant. 2 of them, clearly sisters, examined the materials with the care of those taught to recognize quality. Their dresses were immaculate, their hair perfectly arranged, and their manners revealed the refinement of a polished upbringing. They were exactly the kind of young ladies any man would expect to find in a respectable family. The third young woman, however, seemed to belong to a completely different world. While the sisters discussed the quality of the lace, she kept looking around, as if searching for something or someone. Her clothes, though clean and well cared for, were clearly simpler. Her hands did not have the protected delicacy of her sisters. They were hands that knew work. That was when José Pedro heard the shouting, and everything changed. On the other side of the square, near the pen where animals for sale were kept, a commotion had begun. A short, fat merchant was shouting at a thin, elderly man, accusing him of trying to steal one of his chickens. The old man, clearly frightened, was trying to explain that he had only touched the animal to check if it was healthy before making an offer to buy it. "Wretched thief!" bellowed the merchant, drawing the attention of bystanders. "Trying to steal my goods right under my nose?" The elderly man, with tears in his eyes, begged someone to believe his side of the story. His torn clothes and bare feet betrayed his extreme poverty. It was obvious he barely had money to buy food, let alone to steal chickens in broad daylight at a busy market. João Pedro watched the scene with growing indignation. He knew that merchant well, Antonio Ferreira, a man known for his dishonest practices and for taking advantage of the most vulnerable. It was clear he was falsely accusing the old man, probably to put on a show and scare off other poor people who might dare to bargain down his prices. But before João Pedro could step in, someone else did. The third young woman from the fabric stall had left her sisters behind and was striding determinedly toward the commotion. Her steps were firm, her shoulders straight, and there was something in her posture that made people automatically step aside to let her pass. "Stop this right now," she said, planting herself between the merchant and the old man. Her voice was clear and strong, carrying a natural authority that made Antonio Ferreira stop shouting for a few seconds. "And who are you to give me orders, girl?" he snarled, though João Pedro could hear a note of uncertainty in his voice. "I'm someone who has been watching this stall for 10 minutes and saw exactly what happened," the young woman replied, crossing her arms. "This gentleman touched the chicken for 3 seconds, asked the price, and when you said it cost double the normal amount, he thanked you and walked away. At no point did he try to take anything." The crowd that had gathered began to murmur. Several people confirmed that they had also seen the interaction between the merchant and the old man, and that the young woman's version matched what they had witnessed. Antonio Ferreira realized he was losing control of the situation. "You didn't see anything. You're lying to defend this thief." That was when the young woman did something that left João Pedro completely impressed. She took a small purse from inside her dress, counted out some coins, and held them out to the merchant. "How much is the chicken?" she asked calmly. 2,000 reis, replied Antonio, confused by the sudden shift in the conversation. "Here are 2,000 reis," she said, placing the coins in his hand. "Now the chicken is mine." She turned to the old man and held the animal out to him. "For you, sir, for your family."
The old man was stunned, trying to refuse the gift, but the young woman insisted with such kindness that he finally accepted it, tears streaming down his face. "But I can't accept this, girl. You don't even know me." "I don't need to know you to see that you're an honest person," she replied, smiling for the first time since João Pedro had begun watching her, "and that you have a family waiting for you at home." As the old man walked away holding the chicken as if it were the greatest treasure in the world, João Pedro noticed that the young women's 2 sisters had come closer, their expressions revealing a mix of shame and irritation. "Maria Clara, what have you done now?" the eldest asked, her voice dripping with disapproval. "Only what was right," answered Maria Clara, brushing her hands on her dress. "You spent the family's money on a stranger. Father is going to be furious." "Then I'll explain it to him," said Maria Clara, with a calmness that impressed João Pedro even more. The sisters dragged her away, muttering about improper behavior and how she was always causing trouble. But João Pedro kept watching as they walked off, noticing how Maria Clara walked with her head held high, showing no hint of regret for what she had done. In that moment, something lit up in João Pedro's chest. He had just witnessed something rare, a person who acted according to her conscience, regardless of social or financial consequences. A person who saw the suffering of others and simply could not ignore it. He discreetly asked a few acquaintances about the young women's family and learned that they were the Monteros. The 2 elder daughters were Ana Beatriz and Isabella, known for their beauty and refined manners. The youngest was Maria Clara, about whom opinions were wildly divided. Some described her as problematic, stubborn, someone who meddled where she wasn't called. Others, especially simpler people, spoke of her with admiration and gratitude, telling stories of small acts of kindness she had done without expecting anything in return. João Pedro knew which version was true. And from that day on, Maria Clara Montero never again left his thoughts. What he did not imagine was that 5 years later, destiny would give him the chance to truly get to know that extraordinary woman, and that her parents, who saw her as a burden, were about to make the most beneficial mistake of their lives. Back in the Montero sitting room, the family conspiracy was taking shape with the precision of a military plan. Carlos paced from one side to another, hands clasped behind his back, while a cruel smile spread across his face. Helena remained seated, rereading the letter for the 3rd time, as if she needed to confirm she wasn't dreaming about that perfect opportunity. 5 years, Carlos muttered, stopping abruptly. 5 years dealing with the problems this girl causes us. And now a man shows up asking specifically for her. Ana Beatriz tucked a lock of blonde hair behind her ear. Father, do you think he knows about the incidents? Impossible, Helena replied firmly. João Pedro Silveira lives 2 towns away. If he knew about her reputation, he would never have made this request. Isabella got up and went to the window, watching Maria Clara hanging clothes on the line out back. Look at her, always working, always serious. No man here would marry her. Obviously, this farmer doesn't know what he's getting himself into. And that's exactly what makes this situation so perfect, said Carlos, banging his fist on the table with satisfaction. He's expecting an appropriate wife, well-mannered, submissive. Imagine his surprise when he finds out he chose our Maria Clara. The wickedness of the plan was simple and devastating. They would answer João Pedro's letter confirming the marriage, but would say nothing about Maria Clara's true personality. They would let the man discover on his own that he had asked for the hand of the most problematic daughter in the family. When he finds out what kind of woman she really is, Carlos went on, it'll be too late. The wedding will already have happened, and she'll be his problem, not ours. Helena folded the letter carefully. And the best part is, she'll be far enough away not to interfere in our business anymore. 2 towns away is a blessing.
What they didn't know was that outside the room, Maria Clara had stopped hanging the clothes and was leaning against the wall, listening to every word of the conversation. Her heart was pounding so hard she feared someone might hear it. The family's words echoed in her mind like stones thrown onto a still surface. His problem, not ours. Too late. A blessing. That was how they saw her, as a burden to be dumped on the first man willing to take her. Maria Clara closed her eyes and rested her forehead against the cold wooden wall. For 23 years, she had tried to earn her family's love and respect. She had cared for her sick grandmother, taken on the hardest chores in the house, tried to be an obedient daughter. But none of that mattered because she had committed the unforgivable crime of having a conscience. Every time she exposed an injustice, every time she defended someone helpless, every time she refused to take part in the family's questionable schemes, she had dug her own social grave a little deeper. And now they had finally found a way to get rid of her permanently. The tears she had held back for years finally began to run down her face. They were not tears of sadness, but of painful release. At last she understood that she would never be loved by those people, no matter what she did. To them, she would always be the family's defect, the daughter who had been born wrong. But as she wiped her tears away with the back of her hand, Maria Clara made a decision that would change everything. If they were so desperate to get rid of her, if they thought sending her to a stranger was fitting revenge, then she would turn it into a victory. She would not go into that marriage as a victim. She would go as a woman who had finally understood her own worth, regardless of her family's opinion. If João Pedro Silveira discovered who she really was and decided to reject her, At least she would have the dignity of not having lied about her nature. Inside the room, the Monteros continued plotting their supposed revenge. "We'll write back today," said Carlos. "We'll confirm the wedding and say that Maria Clara is eager to meet her future husband." "And what about the dowry?" Helena asked. "The bare minimum. After all, we're doing her a favor, aren't we?" Carlos laughed at his own cruel joke. Ana Beatriz and Isabella exchanged complicit looks. For years, they had silently competed to see who would marry first and best. The idea that their younger sister, whom they always considered inferior, would marry before them was almost unbearable. But the fact that it would be a doomed marriage took the edge off. "She has no idea what's waiting for her," Isabella murmured with satisfaction. "And when the marriage becomes a disaster, as it surely will," added Ana Beatriz, "at least we won't be the ones dealing with the consequences." What none of them could imagine was that Maria Clara had qualities that far surpassed their limited perceptions. Her honesty, courage, and compassion were exactly the treasures some men spent their whole lives searching for and never found. And that João Pedro Silveira was not an ordinary man, but someone wise enough to recognize true value when he saw it. Maria Clara went back to the clothes line and finished hanging the laundry with mechanical movements. Her hands trembled slightly, but her resolve was firm. In a few weeks, she would leave that house forever. She would leave behind the people who had never managed to love her for who she was. And maybe, just maybe, she would find someone who could. The afternoon dragged on slowly, with Maria Clara absorbed in her thoughts as she did the housework. When dinner time came, she sat at the table as she always did, but this time she watched her family with different eyes. She saw the falseness in their smiles, the cruelty disguised as concern, the morbid satisfaction they tried to hide. "Maria Clara," said Carlos in an artificially affectionate voice, "the wedding will be in a few weeks. You'll leave next Monday to meet your future husband." Maria Clara kept eating in silence, processing the information. 5 days. In 5 days, her life would change completely.
"You don't seem excited," observed Ana Beatriz with fake concern. "I'm just processing it," replied Maria Clara. "It's a big change." "Of course it is," said Carlos, "but I'm sure you'll adapt appropriately." The word appropriately carried the full weight of his expectations. They expected her to fail, to cause trouble, to confirm all their negative perceptions of her. But Maria Clara had decided to surprise them in a way they would never expect. What none of them knew was that João Pedro Silveira had his own secrets, his own reasons for asking specifically for her, and that the family's supposed revenge was about to turn into the greatest blessing of Maria Clara's life. If you're relating to this story so far, click "Thanks a lot" to support the channel. Thanks a lot is a way to contribute financially so that more people can receive stories like this. While the Monteiro family plotted their supposed revenge, 40 kilometers away, João Pedro Silveira was facing a completely different dilemma. Sitting on his porch at the end of the afternoon, watching the cattle graze in the green fields of his property, he held a blank sheet of paper for over an hour, trying to find the right words to write to Maria Clara's family. It wasn't the first time he had considered marriage. At 32, João Pedro had built more than many men managed in an entire lifetime. His farm was thriving, his business respected, and he had enough resources to support a large family. But whenever he thought of marriage, the image that came to mind was not of any beautiful, well-educated woman from the region. It was always Maria Clara. For 5 years, he had carried the memory of that afternoon at the market like a flame in his chest. Not a week had gone by without him thinking about her, wondering what kind of woman she had become, whether she still had that same courageous spirit that had impressed him so much. João Pedro had made some discreet inquiries about the Monteiro family over the years. He learned about Carlos's questionable business dealings, about Ana Beatriz and Isabella's attempts to marry influential men, and especially about Maria Clara's constant interference in local corruption schemes. For any other man, this information would have been reason enough to avoid the family entirely. For João Pedro, it was confirmation that Maria Clara was exactly who he imagined her to be, an upright woman living in a family that neither understood nor valued her integrity. He knew that asking specifically for Maria Clara would raise suspicion. Social logic dictated that he should choose one of the older, prettier sisters, the more suitable ones for a man of his position, but João Pedro had learned to distrust social logic when it clashed with the impulses of his heart. The truth was, he did not want a decorative wife. He didn't want someone who would simply agree with him, keep the house tidy and the children clean. João Pedro wanted a companion in the deepest sense of the word, someone with whom he could share not only the bed and table, but also values, dreams, and worries about what was right and wrong in the world. And Maria Clara, from what he had seen and learned, was the only woman he knew who possessed those qualities. Finally, he dipped the pen in ink and began to write. His words were carefully chosen, respectful but direct. He introduced himself properly, mentioned his property and financial situation, and then made the request he knew would surprise the family. He wished to ask for the hand of Maria Clara Monteiro in marriage. He didn't mention his true reasons. He didn't talk about the market or his admiration for her courage or the 5 years he had spent thinking about her. That would be inappropriate in a formal letter, but he wrote sincerely about his desire to find a wife who valued honesty and integrity as much as he did. When he finished the letter, he read it 3 times before sealing it. He knew he was taking a huge risk. Maria Clara might have changed completely in the last 5 years. She might have become bitter or resentful because of conflicts with her family. She might even reject him outright. But something inside him insisted that it was worth trying.
The next morning, he personally took the letter to the post office, handed it to the clerk, and paid extra to ensure it would arrive quickly. Then he returned home and tried to keep busy with farm duties, though his thoughts kept returning to that letter traveling along the dusty road towards Maria Clara's town. 3 days later, the reply came. João Pedro recognized the masculine handwriting on the envelope at once, obviously Carlos Monteiro's, as was proper. But when he opened it and read the contents, something in the urgency of the acceptance made him slightly uneasy. The letter was cordial, but brief, very brief. Carlos accepted the request enthusiastically, confirmed that Maria Clara was eager to meet her future husband, and suggested she travel the following Monday so they could get to know each other before the wedding. João Pedro frowned. There was something in the tone of the letter that didn't sound entirely natural. It was almost as if the family were a little too eager to seal the deal, as if they wanted to ship Maria Clara off as quickly as possible. He wondered if there was something he didn't know about her, some health problem perhaps, or a recent scandal the family wanted to hide. But then he remembered the young woman he had seen defending a stranger at the market and decided he would face whatever might come. On Monday, Maria Clara would arrive, and then he would finally find out if the 5 years of hope had been worth it. What João Pedro could not imagine was that Maria Clara would also arrive with her own fears and hopes, that she had heard her family planning to use the marriage as a form of revenge against him, and that she had made the brave decision to be completely honest about who she was, regardless of the consequences. 2 lonely hearts were about to meet, both carrying secrets that could turn that arranged marriage into something much deeper and more genuine than either dared hope. But before that could happen, Maria Clara would have to face the hardest journey of her life, leaving behind the only family she had ever known, however cruel they were, and stepping into the unknown with nothing but the hope that perhaps someone would finally see her for who she truly was.
Monday was approaching fast, and with it, the moment that would change two lives forever. Monday arrived under a gray sky that seemed to reflect perfectly the mood in the Montero house. Maria Clara awoke before dawn, as she had every day for the past 5, unable to sleep deeply knowing her life was about to change completely. She had spent the previous week in a state of quiet preparation. She packed her few belongings in a small, worn suitcase that had belonged to her grandmother. She didn't have many clothes. The family had never invested in her wardrobe the way they did with her sisters, but she made sure each piece was clean and well pressed. More important than the clothes, Maria Clara had spent hours reflecting on how she would present herself to João Pedro Silveira. She had decided to be completely honest about who she was, but that didn't mean she wasn't afraid. What if he rejected her? What if, after truly getting to know her, he decided that her family was right and she was just too much trouble? But whenever these thoughts crept in, Maria Clara remembered something fundamental. She would rather be rejected for being herself than accepted because of a lie.
She had spent 23 years trying to bend herself to her family's expectations, and that had only made her more miserable. She would not repeat the same mistake with a husband. Downstairs, breakfast was served in silence. Carlos and Helena exchanged satisfied glances, while Ana Beatriz and Isabella could barely hide their joy at finally seeing Maria Clara leave. The only person who seemed genuinely sad was the grandmother, who held Maria Clara's hand in her trembling fingers. "Will you be happy, my girl?" the old lady whispered, her words filled with a hope Maria Clara didn't feel from anyone else in the family. "You have a good heart. That always finds its place in the world." Maria Clara kissed her grandmother's forehead, feeling tears sting her eyes. She was the only person in that house she would truly miss. The carriage that would take Maria Clara to João Pedro's farm arrived promptly at 8 o'clock. The coachman, a middle-aged man with a kind expression, helped load the suitcase and opened the carriage door with respectful courtesy. "Have a good trip, my daughter," said Carlos, kissing her cheek with a show of affection Maria Clara knew was purely performative. "We hope you will be very happy in your new life." "Write to us," added Helena, though her tone suggested she neither expected nor truly wanted any letters. Ana Beatriz and Isabella waved from the veranda, their smiles far too bright to be sincere. Maria Clara climbed into the carriage without looking back, knowing that if she did, she might lose the courage to leave. The journey to João Pedro's farm would take about 4 hours, traveling along dirt roads that wound between hills and cultivated fields. Maria Clara used the time to organize her thoughts and prepare herself mentally for the meeting that would define her future. She had thought a lot about what she knew of João Pedro Silveira. From the remarks she had overheard over the years, he was known as a just, hard-working, and prosperous man. He had never married, which at 32 was considered unusual but not necessarily problematic. Some men simply preferred to wait until they were fully established before starting a family. What intrigued Maria Clara the most was the fact that he had asked specifically for her. Her sisters were objectively prettier, better trained in the feminine arts, more suitable for a prestigious marriage. Why would a successful man choose the daughter whom her own family considered a problem? There were 2 possibilities. Either he didn't know about her reputation and would have an unpleasant surprise when he got to know her better, or he knew exactly who she was and had his own reasons for wanting her as his wife. Maria Clara couldn't decide which of the 2 possibilities made her more nervous. As the carriage drew closer to its destination, the landscape began to change. The properties became larger and better maintained, the fields more organized, the cattle visibly healthier. It was obvious they were entering an area of genuine prosperity, not the dubious prosperity that characterized her family's businesses. At last, the coachman announced that they had arrived at the Silveira farm. Maria Clara looked out the carriage window and felt her breath catch for a moment.
The property was impressive, not ostentatious, but solid and well-planned. The main house was large enough to shelter a big family, built from hardwood with a wide veranda that invited rest. The stables and barns were laid out in a functional way, and everywhere there were signs that the place was run by someone who truly understood agriculture. But what most caught Maria Clara's attention was the man who stepped out of the house to greet her. João Pedro Silveira was taller than she remembered, with broad shoulders that spoke of years of physical work. His dark hair was streaked with a few gray strands at the temples, and his face bore the marks of someone who spent a lot of time in the sun. But it was his eyes that made her recognize him immediately. The same attentive, intelligent eyes that had watched her at the market 5 years before. She had seen her that day. She was certain of it now. The way he looked at her as the coachman helped her out of the carriage was not the look of a man seeing a stranger for the first time. It was the look of someone who recognized her.
"Miss Maria Clara," he said, approaching with measured steps. His voice was deep and calm, carrying a gentleness that stirred something in her chest. "Welcome to Silveira Farm." "Mr. João Pedro," she replied, offering a small curtsy. "Thank you for receiving me." He took her suitcase from the coachman and gestured towards the house. "You must be tired from the trip. Shall we go inside and talk more comfortably?" As they walked side by side towards the veranda, Maria Clara felt a strange mix of nervousness and relief. There was something in João Pedro's presence that calmed her. He didn't seem like the kind of man who would make hasty judgments or expect her to be someone she wasn't. But she still did not know that João Pedro had spent 5 years imagining this exact moment, that he had asked for her hand not in spite of her reputation, but because of it. And her family, thinking they were playing a cruel trick, had just fulfilled the deepest dream of 2 lonely hearts. The conversation that was about to happen would change everything. And this time, Maria Clara would discover what it meant to be truly seen and valued by someone she had never found in her own family. First, however, she would have to find the courage to be completely honest about who she really was, and hope that this honesty would be welcomed with the understanding she had never found in her own family. The sitting room in João Pedro's house was simple but cozy. Solid wooden furniture, a few books scattered on a side table, and a fireplace giving off a gentle warmth. Maria Clara sat in a comfortable armchair, trying to hide the growing nervousness in her chest. João Pedro served coffee in delicate porcelain cups, a touch of refinement she hadn't expected. "How was your trip?" he asked, sitting in the armchair next to hers. There was a respectful distance between them, but Maria Clara noticed that he watched her attentively, as if trying to read something in her expression. "Calm, thank you," she replied, holding the cup in both hands. The warmth of the porcelain helped keep her hands occupied. "Your property is beautiful. It must have taken years to build all this." 10 years of constant work," said João Pedro with quiet pride. "I bought the land when it was nothing but abandoned pasture. Every pen, every fence, every field was planned and built little by little." Maria Clara nodded, impressed. She knew the value of hard work and could recognize the results when she saw them. "It must be gratifying to see all this grow under your own hands." "It is," he agreed, "but a property this size cries out for a family. A house this big, no matter how well built, is still just an empty house." There was a moment of silence as they both sipped their coffee. Maria Clara knew the time had come for serious talk, the questions that would decide whether that meeting would lead to a wedding or a polite farewell. "Mr. João Pedro," she began, setting her cup back on the saucer, "I need to ask you a direct question." "Please,"
he said, leaning slightly forward. "Why did you ask specifically for me? My sisters are prettier, better trained in the arts expected of a wife. Any sensible man would choose one of them." João Pedro remained silent for a long moment, studying her face. Maria Clara saw something shift in his expression, a decision being made.
"May I be equally direct?" he asked. "Please." "Because I saw you at the market 5 years ago. I saw what you did for that elderly man who was falsely accused of stealing. I saw you spend your own money to buy the chicken and give it to him without expecting anything in return." Maria Clara felt the blood rush to her face. "You were there?" "I was. And I've spent 5 years thinking about the woman who had the courage to do what was right, even knowing her family would disapprove." Juan Pedro leaned closer. "Miss Maria Clara, I don't want a wife who is pretty and silent. I want a companion with the moral strength to do what was right, even when it's hard." His words struck Maria Clara like a bolt of lightning. Her entire life, her family had criticized her for the very qualities Juan Pedro was praising. It was as if the world had been turned upside down. "But you must know," she said, gathering the courage to go on being honest, "that my family considers me a problem. They sent me here because they want to get rid of me, not because they think I'd make a good wife for you." "I suspected as much," Juan Pedro replied calmly. "The speed with which they accepted my proposal was very telling." "And even knowing that, you still want to marry me?" Juan Pedro stood and walked to the window, looking out at the fields stretching beyond the house. "Maria Clara, can I tell you something about myself?" "Of course." "I could have married any one of a dozen women over the last 10 years, all pretty, all from respectable families, all sensible choices." He turned to face her. "But every time I thought about marriage, I remembered that young woman at the market who defended a stranger, and no other woman could compare to that memory." Maria Clara felt tears sting her eyes. "You don't really know me. I might disappoint you. Or you might be exactly what my life needs," he said, returning to his seat. "Maria Clara, may I make you a proposal?" "What kind of proposal?" "That we spend a few weeks truly getting to know each other, without pressure, without impossible expectations. If at the end of that time we find we're compatible, we'll marry. If not, I'll help you find a suitable situation, whether that means returning to your family or finding another arrangement that makes you happy." The generosity of the offer left Maria Clara speechless. "You would do that, even if I decided not to marry you?" "I would. Because a woman with your character deserves to have choices in life, not just be pushed from one unhappy situation into another." For the first time in years, Maria Clara felt something she had almost forgotten. Hope. Hope that perhaps there might be a place in the world where she could be accepted exactly as she was. "And if I accept this proposal," she said slowly, "do you promise I can be completely honest about who I am, even if some things about me bother you?" "Especially then," Juan Pedro replied. "Lies and pretense are a terrible foundation for any relationship, least of all a marriage." Maria Clara took a deep breath. "Then I accept your proposal, but on one condition." "What condition?" "That you also be completely honest with me about your expectations, your fears, your dreams. If we're going to truly know each other, it has to work both ways." Juan Pedro smiled, the first genuine smile she had seen from him since her arrival. "Agreed." They shook hands to seal the agreement, and Maria Clara felt a current run up her arm at his touch. There was something about this man that made her feel safe and challenged at the same time, as if he could handle her strength without trying to diminish it. "So," said Juan Pedro, "how about we start with a tour of the property? I want to show you everything and hear your honest opinions about what you see." Maria Clara got up, feeling lighter than she had in years. "I'd love that. But I should warn you, I have opinions about many things." "Excellent," he said, offering her his arm. "I was counting on that." As they left the house together, Maria Clara couldn't help thinking about the irony of the situation. Her family had tried to get rid of her by sending her to a man who was supposedly being deceived about her true nature. Instead, she had found someone who wanted her precisely because of who she was. But there was still much to discover about João Pedro Silveira, and Maria Clara was determined to use those weeks to find out whether the man who had impressed her at the market could be the partner she had always dreamed of. Maybe, just maybe, her family had just given her life's most precious gift without even meaning to. The weeks that followed passed like a dream for Maria Clara. Every morning brought new discoveries about farm life, about João Pedro, and surprisingly, about herself. For the first time in her life, she was in an environment where her opinions were not only tolerated, but actively sought out. João Pedro kept his promise of complete honesty. During their walks around the property, he shared his plans to expand the cattle operations, his dreams of building a school for the workers' children, and his worries about the droughts that occasionally hit the region. Maria Clara discovered that she had valuable ideas about rural management, ideas that came from her natural capacity to observe and her concern for people's well-being. "What if we built a system of connected cisterns?" she suggested one afternoon as they watched workers hauling water for the cattle. "That way, even during drought, we'd have enough reserves." João Pedro stopped walking and looked at her with admiration. "That's brilliant. Why didn't I think of that?" "Because you think like a man who has always had resources. I think like someone who grew up watching people suffer because no one planned ahead." It was that kind of exchange that made João Pedro's heart beat faster. Maria Clara not only had a remarkable sense of justice, but also a practical intelligence that perfectly complemented his own skills. She saw angles he missed, questioned decisions he made automatically, and always with the goal of improving people's lives. But it wasn't only the practical aspects of life that drew them closer. During their long evening conversations on the porch, watching the sunset, they discovered an emotional compatibility that surprised them both. "Tell me about your family," João Pedro asked one afternoon. Maria Clara hesitated for a moment, then decided to keep her promise of complete honesty. "They see me as a mistake, someone who was born with flaws they can't fix." "What kind of flaws?" "I care too much for strangers. I ask inconvenient questions. I can't pretend not to see injustice." Maria Clara looked down at her hands. "My mother always said a lady should be like a pretty doll, seen but not heard." João Pedro stayed quiet for a long time. "And what do you think about that?" "I think a life without purpose is not worth living. If you're able to help someone or improve a situation, how can you just ignore it?" "Exactly," said João Pedro firmly. "Maria Clara, do you know the difference between you and your sisters?" "They're beautiful," she said with a bitter smile. "They're decorative. You are transformative." He turned fully to face her. "Your sisters can beautify a room. You can change a life, transform a community. That is infinitely more valuable." His words touched something deep in Maria Clara's soul. For the first time, someone not only accepted her most problematic traits, but saw them as virtues. "Tell me in the comments," the narrator breaks in. "Would you do what Maria Clara did? Would you leave your family to marry someone you barely know, but who truly values you?" As the days passed, the attraction between them grew naturally and intensely. It wasn't just mutual respect or intellectual compatibility. There was physical chemistry too, in the lingering looks, the casual touches that seemed to last longer than necessary, the way Maria Clara's heart raced whenever João Pedro smiled at her.
One night, as they walked through the garden under the starlight, João Pedro suddenly stopped. "Maria Clara, I need to tell you something." "What is it?" "I didn't plan for this to happen so quickly, but—" He took a deep breath. "I'm falling in love with you. Not with the idea of you I carried in my head for 5 years, but with the real woman you are." Maria Clara felt as if her heart would explode in her chest. "João Pedro, I know we promised to just get to know each other without pressure, and I stand by that promise. If you need more time, or if you decide you don't feel the same, I feel the same," she interrupted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm also falling in love with your kindness, your honesty, with the way you make me feel I can be myself without fear." João Pedro stepped closer, raising a hand to gently touch her face. "May I kiss you?" In response, Maria Clara rose on tiptoe and met his lips with hers. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative, then deepened into an intensity that made them both tremble. When they finally pulled apart, they stayed wrapped in each other's arms under the stars, feeling that something fundamental had changed between them. They were no longer two strangers testing a possibility. They were two people who had found something rare and precious in one another. "Marry me," João Pedro whispered into her hair. "Not because our families arranged it, but because I can't imagine my life without you." "Yes," Maria Clara replied without hesitation. "Yes, I want to marry you." That night, lying in the room João Pedro had prepared for her, Maria Clara thought about the incredible journey her life had taken. 3 weeks earlier, she had been the rejected daughter of a family that saw her as a burden. Now, she was the chosen bride of a man who loved her exactly as she was. Her family had tried to use the marriage as a cruel revenge, a way to ship off the troublesome daughter to an innocent man. Instead, they had inadvertently created the perfect union between two souls who completed each other. Maria Clara smiled in the darkness, thinking about the delicious irony of it all. Her parents were probably celebrating, thinking they had played the perfect trick on João Pedro Silveira. Little did they know they had just fulfilled the deepest dreams of two people who were destined to meet. The wedding would be the following week, and Maria Clara knew with absolute certainty that it would be the beginning of the life she had always dreamed of, but had never dared believe was possible. For the first time in 23 years, she fell asleep completely happy. But the real surprise would come when her family discovered that the marriage they had planned as revenge had turned into the greatest love story the region had ever seen. The wedding of Maria Clara and João Pedro took place on a sunny Saturday morning in the small church of the neighboring town. The ceremony was simple, but filled with an emotion that touched everyone present. Maria Clara wore a dress João Pedro had commissioned especially for her. Not ostentatious, but elegant, in a shade of blue that brought out her eyes. The Montero family did not attend. They sent only a cold letter congratulating the couple and wishing them luck in their marriage. Maria Clara read the letter on the morning of the wedding and threw it into the fireplace without showing any emotion.
That family belonged to her past. Her new life was beginning. João Pedro, on the other hand, had invited all the farm workers and their families, friends from other properties, and even some humble townsfolk whom Maria Clara had helped over the years. The church was filled with people who truly loved them and rooted for their happiness.
During the ceremony, when João Pedro held Maria Clara's hands and promised to love, protect, and respect her for the rest of his life, she saw tears of emotion in his eyes. And when she made her own vows to be his loyal companion, his honest counselor, and his best friend forever, her voice was firm and clear, without a trace of hesitation. They were no longer two strangers brought together by convenience. They were two people deeply in love who had consciously chosen to build a life together. The reception after the wedding was unforgettable. Guests danced late into the night, enjoyed the plentiful food prepared by local women, and celebrated a union that everyone could see was rooted in true love. Maria Clara had never felt so surrounded by affection and acceptance. But the real surprise came 3 months later, when Carlos Montero turned up at the farm unexpectedly. Maria Clara was in the garden, picking flowers to decorate the dinner table, when she saw the family carriage coming up the road. Her first reaction was panic. What did her family want now? But then she remembered she was no longer the rejected, vulnerable daughter. She was Maria Clara Silveira, mistress of her own home, married to a man who respected her, living the life she had chosen. João Pedro came out of the house at the sound of the carriage and naturally took his place at his wife's side. His presence was a silent reminder that Maria Clara no longer had to face her family alone. Carlos stepped down from the carriage with an expression Maria Clara had never seen on him before, a mix of discomfort and something that looked almost like respect. "Maria Clara," he said, removing his hat. "João Pedro." He gave her husband a curt nod that seemed forced. "Father," Maria Clara replied coldly, "what brings you here?" Carlos looked around the property, clearly impressed by what he saw. The farm had prospered even more in recent months, with improvements reflecting the perfect partnership between João Pedro and Maria Clara. New pens, clever irrigation systems, a small but functional school for the workers' children. Everything on view was proof of management that combined prosperity with social responsibility. "I came to talk business," Carlos said at last. "What kind of business?" João Pedro asked, his arm slipping protectively around Maria Clara's waist. Carlos took a deep breath, as if about to swallow something bitter. "You may have heard about the problems in our region." Maria Clara hadn't, but she could imagine. "What kind of problems?" "The judge was arrested for corruption. Several families are under investigation for involvement in land-grabbing schemes. Our family—" Carlos paused, clearly uncomfortable. "Our family may face some financial difficulties." The irony was not lost on Maria Clara. The same illegal activities she had tried to expose years ago were finally being investigated by federal authorities. If her family had listened to her warnings back then, they might have avoided the scandal. "And what does that have to do with us?" João Pedro asked. Carlos looked directly at Maria Clara. "We were wondering if you could intercede for us. Maybe use your influence with your husband to help us financially during this difficult period." The silence that followed was deafening. Maria Clara looked at the man who spent 23 years making her feel inadequate, who sent her away as if she were a punishment for João Pedro, who celebrated when he thought he was rid of her for good. "Father," she said at last, her voice calm but firm, "all my life you told me I was a problem, that my opinions were inconvenient,
that my conscience was a flaw. You sent me here thinking it was revenge against my husband." Carlos lowered his eyes, clearly uncomfortable.
"But now that you need help, suddenly I'm someone whose influence is worth something? Maria Clara, you're our daughter." "No," she cut in. "A daughter is loved, protected, valued. I was a burden you finally managed to dump. The difference is that you thought you were punishing me, but in fact, you gave me the greatest gift of my life." João Pedro gently squeezed her hand, a silent gesture of support. "I won't help you financially," she went on, "not because I lack compassion, but because helping you would be enabling the same corrupt practices I've always criticized. You made your choices. Now live with the consequences." Carlos flushed with anger. "After everything we've done for you! What have you done for me?" Maria Clara's voice rose slightly. "Made me feel inadequate for having a conscience? Punished me for defending what's right? Or sent me away thinking you were harming an innocent man? We raised you, fed you, educated you. You did the bare minimum the law demands of parents. But you never loved me for who I am. João Pedro has known me for just a few months and values me more than you did in an entire lifetime." Carlos looked at João Pedro with fury. "And you're going to allow your wife to talk to her own father like that?" João Pedro smiled, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Mr. Montero, my wife is free to express her opinions. In fact, that's exactly why I married her, because of the courage you always tried to destroy." Realizing he wouldn't get what he wanted, Carlos stormed back to the carriage. Before leaving, he hurled one last insult. "You'll regret this." Maria Clara and João Pedro stood hand in hand, watching the carriage disappear. When it was finally out of sight, Maria Clara turned to her husband. "Did I do the right thing?" "You did the only thing you could do, being who you are," he replied, kissing her forehead. "And I love you even more for it." That night, as they had dinner in the dining room that was truly theirs now, Maria Clara reflected on the extraordinary journey she had taken. The family that tried to get rid of her like garbage was now begging for her help. The man who was supposed to be the victim of a cruel prank became her greatest love and support. "Do you know what's funniest about all this?" she asked João Pedro. "What?" "My parents actually thought they were playing a trick on you, sending the defective daughter to ruin your life." João Pedro laughed, a warm, rich sound that filled the room. "And they'll never understand that they gave me exactly the treasure I'd been searching for all my life." Maria Clara smiled, feeling her heart fill with gratitude. "Sometimes the greatest blessings come disguised as the worst curses." "And sometimes," said João Pedro, taking her hand across the table, "the people who tried to hurt us end up pushing us towards our true destiny." They finished dinner in peace, knowing they had built something beautiful and solid together, a partnership based on mutual respect, true love, and shared values. Maria Clara would never again be the rejected daughter. She was now the beloved wife, the respected advisor, the woman who had found her place in the world beside someone who loved her exactly as she was, perfect in her imperfection, valuable in her authenticity, loved in her wholeness.